Put that paperback somewhere it cannot take another person out with it.
It has survived 170 years. It can survive the arm of a chair.
That is not the chair's biography. The chair has a record.
Your argument is that the book fell because I have no system.
My argument is that your system involves a stack of books with a lower center of gravity than our cat.
Which book is it?
Uncle Tom's Cabin. It slid out just as I was reading an article in which somebody called somebody else an Uncle Tom. No explanation. The phrase arrived as a moral verdict.
The title is much more mobile than the novel now.
That is what bothered me. I knew what the accusation was meant to do. Everyone knows, more or less. It means, you are too comfortable with power. You have made yourself useful to the wrong people. You have forgotten who you should be standing with.
You knew the function of the phrase before you knew its story.
But I also realized that I could use the phrase with the confidence of someone who had not asked whether the character himself did any of those things.
You were not ignorant of the phrase. You were fluent in it.
Fluency is the embarrassing part. Nobody pauses to reconstruct the 19th century plot before using the phrase. It arrives as a settled verdict.
The phrase makes a quick, repeatable judgment.
And I have used it privately, before I knew enough about the person.
You have.
Including you, obviously.
I had suspected as much.
But the question cannot be only whether people forgot to read a famous book.
Nor can it be, the book explains everything. A name becomes portable because it enters other institutions, other media, other arguments. People inherit a name because it becomes useful for something.
So the question is not simply, what did Harriet Beecher Stowe mean? It is, what had to happen for a name to become easier to carry than a story?
I am YY. Welcome to Critical Animal, a podcast about culture, ethics, history, and the lives of animals.
I am Bear. In our video essays, every argument begins with a specific story. But in a deep cut, we stay with the story until it gets uncomfortable. And what gets left behind when Uncle Tom does?
There is one awkward fact we should put on the table immediately. It makes the modern phrase much harder to use as though it were a plot summary.
Tom refuses two things that would make him an instrument of Legree's power.
The first is that Legree wants him to whip Lucy, who is sick and weak. Tom refuses. He says, "If you mean to kill me, kill me. But as to my raising my hand again anyone here, I never shall. I'll die first."
Legree is not merely asking Tom to obey. He is asking him to administer violence against another enslaved person. That is the point of the demand.
And Tom does not answer with a vague declaration that he is a good man. He says he will not raise his hand against her.
The second refusal comes when Cassy and Emmeline have escaped. Legree demands information that will allow him to recapture them. Tom says that he knows, but he cannot tell. I can die.
Which is not really the sentence of a man who has chosen safety over solidarity.
No. It is the sentence of a person who knows precisely what punishment may follow and refuses to send fugitives back.
The correction is clear. In the novel, Tom does not cheerfully collaborate with Legree against other enslaved people. He refuses delegated violence. He refuses betrayal.
But the correction does not end the history of the name.
But that distinction needs qualification.
A correct plot summary cannot dissolve a later political vocabulary. It would be a mistake to treat every different use of the phrase as a failure to understand Stowe.
And it would make Black political language sound like an error, which the novel could correct from above.
The text matters. But a character name may enter another conflict and acquire another force without becoming a faithful description of that character.
Still, Tom's refusals have to come first. Otherwise, the listener reaches the later political meaning with no sense of what is being selected away.
They also need to be placed inside the novel's religious form. Tom tells Legree that his soul is not the master's property. The language is Christian. His refusal is carried by conscience, prayer, martyrdom, forgiveness.
Which is powerful, but not innocent.
Powerful because it denies the master total possession. Not innocent because a martyr can be remembered as patient, and patience can later be made to look like submission.
That is the first terrible bit of portability. A scene of refusal can become a figure of endurance. A figure of endurance can become a type. And a type can become an insult.
Potentially, but not automatically. We must be careful with every arrow in that sentence.
You are already guarding the arrows.
Someone has to. Otherwise, we will turn several historical fields into one sequence and lose the differences among them.
Fine, no tidy arrows. But then we need a different way to ask how feeling travels, because Stowe's novel plainly wants feeling to travel.
But feeling needs infrastructure.
We often speak about a book moving readers as if the reader is alone in a room, struck by an emotion, and history then obediently rearranges itself outside the window.
That is a very luxurious account of circulation.
It is also suspiciously flattering to books.
The novel first appeared in installments in the abolitionist newspaper The National Era, beginning in June 1851. In 1852, it appeared as a 2-volume book through John P. Jewett and Company. Those are not decorative publishing facts. They are part of the form in which a long story becomes repeatable, discussable, lendable, and available to different publics.
A serial asks you to come back. It distributes attention over time. It lets a pursuit, a family separation, a departure, or a death hold open a space between issues.
And a book is a different object again. It can be bought, borrowed, given, reviewed, attacked, reissued, staged. It can sit on a chair arm and injure the inattentive. I'm trying to keep the argument domestic.
The novel itself understands that feeling has systems behind it. The early sales scenes are not simply a private sadist being nasty. Mr. Shelby is under pressure from debt. Haley speaks the language of price, resale, usefulness, and character. A child becomes an asset. Tom's Christianity becomes an asset. Family relation has to compete with property relation.
And Stowe makes that competition uncomfortable for readers who might think they are very far from the sale. At the auction, the narrator points out that the proceeds are being sent to a member of a Christian church in New York.
It is such an unpleasant sentence because it moves the transaction away from the obvious villain. The trader is visible. The money is portable. Respectability is portable too.
The line is not a documentary record of a named churchgoer. It is the novel's indictment. But the indictment is structural. Stowe asks readers to see how property, finance, religion, and comfort can cooperate across distance.
So sentiment here is not simply feel sorry for someone. It is also feel implicated. Let the reader discover that the scene of suffering has connections to the life they consider respectable.
Feeling becomes public through forms of connection. Print, law, credit, family, church, the market. None is outside the scene.
That changes how we think about the famous moments. We tend to remember a person in motion, a child in danger, a room full of tears. But the portable scene is sitting on top of conditions that are harder to picture and harder to carry. It is very tempting to treat that as a defect in other readers. I can see the scene, so I congratulate myself on seeing it. But images ask very little of us at first. A river, a child, a mother. The moral arrangement is available before we have learned anything about debt, law, or a contract.
Which is why the scene can travel so well.
It gives feeling an immediate sequence. You see danger, you take a side. You feel that your taking a side has cost you something. But the people who made the danger profitable do not have to remain in view.
The novel tries to put them back. Mr. Shelby's debt, Haley's calculation, the church member receiving money. Those are not side plots. They are the arrangements behind the scene that later looks immediate.
And there is an awkward teaching problem here. If I show Eliza on the ice first, students will understandably hold on to it. If I begin with debt and sale, they may think I am rationing the novel's emotional force before it has had a chance to work.
Perhaps the lesson is not to choose one over the other. The question is what the image requires us to remember after it has done its work.
But a scene becomes serious not because we refuse its pull. It becomes serious when we ask what made that pull possible and who has been placed inside it.
Which is why Eliza's escape must not begin on the ice.
It begins before anyone can see it. The image people remember is Eliza crossing the Ohio River with Harry in her arms. It is memorable because it concentrates a mother, a child, pursuit, ice, a threshold, and the danger of one misstep into a single scene.
But the river is not the beginning of the story. The beginning is Sale.
Eliza learns that Harry is to be sold south. The horror is not merely that she will be separated from her child. It is that the legal and commercial order makes the separation imaginable, speakable, and profitable.
The escape comes after property has already entered the household and redefined kinship. The ice scene can make the danger look like weather, when the underlying conditions are market relations.
That is very bare. You have turned a river into an economic system.
The system did it first.
I still want to keep the force of the image. It is not wrong that people remember it. A mother carrying a child through danger is an immediate moral fact. You do not need a footnote to understand why it holds attention.
No. But you do need the earlier conditions if you want to understand what the image is attention to.
And Eliza is not simply swept into a scene that makes her moving. She prepares. She decides. Mrs. Shelby gives her money and directs her toward the Quaker settlement. Her action is real, but it is not the fantasy of solitary heroism either.
Her action under coercion depends here on money, route knowledge, and assistance within the household and beyond it.
This is the problem with an iconic scene. It begins to travel as a picture of courage. Then the law, debt, sale, assistance, and pursuit recede from view. The picture becomes portable because it is compressed. I do not mean that an audience should be ashamed of responding to Eliza. There is a version of criticism that makes every immediate feeling look childish, as though intelligence begins only when the heart has been removed from the room.
That would misunderstand Stowe's technique and the reader's problem.
The problem is not that the scene moves us. The problem is when being moved convinces us that we have reached the end of the thought. We remember the leap and forget the arrangements that made a mother's leap necessary.
And then courage itself can become misleading. It looks like an individual possession rather than an action shaped by information, assistance, timing, and the cracks in a system that otherwise claims total control.
Which matters later when people want a single heroic figure to carry a whole political vocabulary. Eliza is brave, but the novel does not give us bravery in a vacuum. It gives us a network of danger and help.
The compression can be morally clarifying and historically thinning at the same time.
I wish I had understood that before I taught my first classes. I had slides full of images and a private belief that more images meant more historical understanding.
Eliza shows that the novel makes suffering public through movement. Eva and Topsy show another method: objects, gifts, and a white child's power to make feeling visible.
Eva's scenes have a different tempo. Eliza gives us pursuit. Eva gives us assembly. A room, a child, people gathered around her, objects distributed before death.
Hair, a Bible, a gift, a remembered word. Feeling is made into something that can be carried.
That is what I find both moving and unnerving. A keepsake preserves emotion in physical form. You put feeling somewhere physical because a person is about to leave the room forever.
And the novel knows that an object can continue the scene after the scene is over.
In the deathbed sequence, Eva defends Topsy as someone who only loves me and nobody loves her. The scene makes Topsy's abandonment legible through Eva's account of neglected affection.
But Topsy becomes legible through Eva's feeling. The white child's innocence is made the medium through which black abandonment can be publicly recognized.
Which is not the same as saying the compassion is fake.
No. It is saying compassion has a form. It has a route. It has a hierarchy.
And it asks a rather difficult question. Who is allowed to interpret another person's pain? Topsy's situation becomes morally urgent because Eva feels it, and we are asked to feel Eva feeling it.
The novel has not stopped caring about Black suffering. It has changed the person through whom that suffering becomes visible.
That is the point at which sentiment becomes more than tears. It is a distribution of attention. It gives us some bodies at the center of interpretation and others at the edge of it. And it also explains why some objects survive so easily. A lock of hair, a Bible, a child's last instruction. They make feeling portable, but can detach it from the person, room, and conditions that produced it.
The object preserves feeling, but it also frames it.
It tells us which feeling has become shareable. Eva's death asks readers to mourn a white child whose spiritual sensitivity is made universally legible. Topsy's abandonment becomes visible within that mourning. I do not want to make that observation sound like an accusation against grief.
It is an observation about mediation.
Grief can be sincere and still organize attention unequally. That is harder to say, because it asks us to notice hierarchy inside a feeling we would prefer to leave untouched.
The novel's tenderness is neither canceled nor absolved by that hierarchy.
Because this is where I need Bear's correction. I am inclined to say, at least Eva loves Topsy. But at least can become a very low threshold when the question is who gets to be recognized as a full person without a white child doing the recognition for them.
You have corrected yourself before I had the chance.
Which is why Tom cannot carry the entire argument about Black agency either. We need Cassy. And we need a voice beside the novel that changes the conditions of speaking.
Harriet Jacobs.
I want to return to Tom, because we have just spent a long time showing how the novel distributes feeling unevenly. It would be easy to make him disappear into the critique.
He should not disappear. But he should not become the sole representative of Black resistance either.
When Tom refuses to beat Lucy, and then refuses to reveal Cassy and Emmeline's escape, the novel gives us a moral argument that is very concrete. He will not become the person who hurts another enslaved person for Legree. He will not become the person who returns fugitives to him.
And he is frightened of something beyond physical punishment. He fears becoming hard, becoming like the people around him. In George L. Aiken's 1858 acting edition, that fear is stated quite starkly. He worries that he may grow, little by little, just like him.
Tom's Christianity does not merely justify suffering. It gives him a reason not to join the violence.
But Christian martyrdom can absorb other kinds of action into an image of patience.
Cassy changes the argument.
In her speech, Cassy says that, "You are all to be bought and paid for, and your souls belong to whoever gets you."
I hear Cassy almost as an answer to the pious sentence about the soul. Tom says, "You cannot buy my soul." Cassy says, "This is a world that behaves as if every part of us can be bought."
They are not simply opposites. They are two pressures inside the same system. Tom holds on to an interior freedom that Legree cannot possess. Cassy describes the totality of a system that tries to make interior freedom irrelevant by taking the body, the child, the household, the future.
And then she plans. That is what gets lost if we use her only to contrast with Tom. She sees Legree's superstitions. She understands the plantation's fears. She turns his fear into part of an escape route.
Her tactical intelligence is not less moral because it is less saintly. Cassy reminds us that agency under coercion is not one thing. It may be refusal. It may be care. It may be keeping a secret. It may be planning around someone else's irrationality. It may be getting out. It may be refusing the demand that suffering become beautiful before anyone will recognize it.
That last part is why Harriet Jacobs has to come into the conversation.
Jacobs' Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl was published in 1861 under the pseudonym Linda Brent. It is a first-person narrative.
And the form matters here.
Jacobs writes about being told that she is property, that she must be subject to her enslaver's will in all things. Then she writes, "My soul revolted against the mean tyranny."
That sentence is so close to Tom's claim about the soul, and yet the field of pressure is different. Jacobs is writing about sexual threat, domestic proximity, law, a girl becoming a woman under someone else's ownership, and the fact that the house is not a refuge.
Property is not only a sale at a market. It is an intimate claim over the body, the room, the future, the conditions under which one can speak.
We should be careful not to turn this into a simplistic game of fiction versus truth. Jacobs is writing in the first person, but the book was published under a pseudonym and edited by Lydia Maria Child. Publication is part of its history.
The point is not that Jacobs is somehow unmediated while Stowe is mediated. The point is that their forms of address are different. Stowe constructs scenes in a sentimental novel. Jacobs addresses readers as a Black woman narrating danger, persuasion, self-protection, and the cost of publicity.
And Jacobs was published in 1861. We are not going to commit the absurdity of claiming Stowe borrowed from a book published after Uncle Tom's Cabin. The comparison changes the question. Instead of asking which character is the real emblem of resistance, we ask what kinds of coercion each text makes visible, and what kinds of action become possible inside it.
Tom refuses to become Legree's instrument. Cassy plans against a system that has taken family and safety from her. Jacobs narrates the revolt of a soul inside a gendered ownership relation. None of these positions cancels the others.
And that matters because the later phrase, Uncle Tom, is often thrown like a single test. Did you stand with power or against it? But the texts we are reading keep saying that depends on what power is demanding, what danger it makes ordinary, and what room remains for action. I think that is why I resisted Cassy at first. Not her, obviously, but the demand she makes on the argument. Tom allows me to recognize a refusal.
Cassy asks what a refusal looks like when survival has already been made ugly.
She makes me recognize that refusal may have to be planned through terror, kinship loss, a body watched by someone else, and the possibility that surviving has not yet looked virtuous enough for an audience.
There is a long tradition of making endurance morally beautiful when it is performed by people with no authority to refuse the conditions that demand it.
And then admiring the beauty instead of asking why the demand was there. Cassy interrupts that admiration. She makes moral judgment more difficult.
Jacobs interrupts it differently. Her first-person address does not permit the reader to remain only a spectator of a character's virtue. She makes the reader confront a social relation that takes place in rooms, families, law, reputation, and published language.
The phrase, "my soul revolted," is so important because it is not a declaration that the world has become bearable. It marks an interior refusal inside a world that has made ordinary life intolerable.
And that makes the comparison with Tom more exact. We are not asking which one embodies a modern ideal. We are asking what each text makes legible about coercion and resistance.
There is also a formal caution. Stowe's novel can distribute attention among characters and scenes. Jacobs addresses a reader from a position she must make credible under conditions of racialized disbelief. The difference is not technical decoration. It changes the stakes of speech.
Which means a later political shorthand cannot be tested against one purified moral figure. It inherits a crowded archive, refusal, strategy, compromised institutions, gendered danger, religious language, property, and publication.
There is another reason I want to hold Tom, Cassy, and Jacobs together before we move on. They keep interrupting my desire for a clean moral taxonomy. Tom does not become good by winning. Cassy does not become legible only when she is gentle.
And Jacobs does not become persuasive because danger has left her life.
Each text asks us to recognize action before it has been made comfortable for a reader.
And each resists a single language of courage. Tom's refusal is public and final. Cassy's intelligence is tactical and shaped by concealment. Jacobs's narrative takes the risk of making private coercion speakable. The differences matter as much as the shared revolt against ownership.
which means that when we later hear a name used as a quick judgment, we should ask what kind of action the judgment expects. Does it recognize only public confrontation? Does it mistake survival for acquiescence? Does it demand that someone prove solidarity in a form that puts them at greater risk?
Those are questions for the political field in which the name is being used. They cannot be answered in advance by one literary character.
And the three texts do not ask the reader to recognize action in the same way. Tom's refusal is staged as a decision another person can witness. He says no to two commands in front of the person who can punish him.
Cassie's action depends on reading a plantation she cannot control. Her knowledge has to remain partly hidden until it can become an escape route. If we demand the same visibility from her that we demand from Tom, we will miss what she is doing.
And Jacobs gives us another formal condition. She addresses a reader from inside the danger she is describing, while also having to make that address credible in a culture organized by racial disbelief. The first person does not remove mediation. Publication under a pseudonym and Lydia Maria Child's editorial role remain part of the book's history.
But it does mean that the reader meets a speaker who names sexual threat, domestic proximity, and ownership from within that pressure. The difference is not a competition over who suffered more. It changes what resistance can look like and what evidence a reader is asked to recognize.
So the later political question cannot demand one visible gesture from everyone and call every other form of survival a failure. The book does not give us a template for every later disagreement. It gives us an archive that makes shorthand harder to use carelessly.
It also gives us a warning. When a system makes some kinds of action visible and others invisible, later readers may inherit the visibility without inheriting the system that produced it.
Which brings us to the stage. Because a stage has to decide what part of this complicated field can be seen, heard, sung, advertised, and remembered, the phrase Tom Show compresses several distinct histories into one label. It has to explain commercial theater, racial caricature, melodrama, music, touring, publicity, audience desire, and the later political life of a name. It is being asked to explain too many distinct historical processes at once.
So, we are going to use three named objects instead. First, a printed acting edition of George L. Aiken's Uncle Tom's Cabin from 1858. Second, a National Theater broadside from July 1853. Third, the November 1853 indicator notice in the National Era.
Three objects, three kinds of claim. They are related but distinct objects, not one continuous script.
The Aiken text gives us a scene. Act 6, Scene 1 places Tom in an old, roofless shed. Cassie brings water. The scene is compressed into bodies, speech, music, and exit.
A novel can stay with a thought for pages. It can tell us what happens before, after, and elsewhere. A stage gives you a dark landscape, a body on the ground, someone entering with water, a piece of music, a decision about who exits and when.
That does not mean the stage removes Tom's ethical resistance. In the documented Aiken text, the fear of becoming cruel remains. The scene changes form. It does not simply become its opposite.
Otherwise, we would reduce the history to a simple opposition, a complicated novel versus a simplified commercial theater.
But commercial transformation is selection, not a single fall from grace. The 1853 broadside advertises a production in 6 acts, 8 tableaus, and 30 scenes, interspersed with singing and dancing. That is marketing evidence. It tells us what producers wanted people to notice and buy.
It does not tell us exactly what happened in every performance. It certainly does not tell us what every audience member felt.
The notice, attributed to one correspondent, reports something else. A later heavenly tableau after Tom's death, bringing Eva, Tom, and St. Clair together. The correspondent thought it helped prevent people leaving too abruptly after the death scene.
You have staged the death scene. Now you still have to manage the audience's exit.
A practical question can become a formal one. How do you end a story for bodies sitting in a room? The novel's death becomes a tableau. The tableau becomes a way of holding or releasing an audience.
So theater gives us a real history of selection. Scenery, song, tableau, actor, advertising, closure. It helps explain how some scenes or relations can become more culturally portable than the dense plot around them. And it gives us a reason to be precise about the word selection. Selection is not necessarily a conspiracy. A theater cannot stage every sentence of a long novel. It has to make choices about time, bodies, sound, and an ending people can leave with.
But those choices have consequences. A tableau can make a relation memorable. A song can produce feeling before an argument has been spoken. An advertised number of scenes can promise abundance before the audience knows what the story will ask of them.
That is why I do not want to call theater a betrayal. Betrayal is too satisfying. It allows us to imagine a pure novel being dirtied by commerce. The novel itself was already trying to make feelings circulate through print, markets, religion, and public address.
Commercial performance intensifies and redistributes that circulation. It does not create the whole problem from nothing.
But neither can it bear the whole explanation for a later political word. That is the temptation. Find a middle term, blame it, and treat the genealogy as solved.
It does not document a direct causal line to the 1925 cartoon.
The distinction among these objects may sound technical, but it prevents us from making claims they cannot support. The Aiken scene lets us compare words and bodies inside a staged moment.
The broadside lets us see how a production was advertised for sale. The notice gives us one observer's account of a later ending and its effect on people leaving the theater. Each object answers a different question. The acting edition does not tell us the whole 1853 production. A broadside does not tell us what every performance contained. One correspondence notice does not establish a general audience response.
But the limits do not make the materials useless. They tell us that commercial theater worked through selection in several forms: writing, publicity, music, tableau, and the practical management of a public evening.
And that is enough to establish a field of mediation. It is not enough to turn the field into a single cause of the later political category.
That direct causal claim is what we refuse. If stage history cannot carry the whole burden, where do we go to understand the later political name?
To a different public sphere, to Black journalism and labor struggle.
This is the point where my first instinct gets into trouble. I began with Tom's 2 refusals and thought, surely that settles something. Surely it means the later insult has lost contact with the character.
It does mean that the later insult is not a plot summary, but it does not tell us what the name was doing in another conflict.
The object we have is a full-page cartoon titled Uncle Tom's, published in the Messenger magazine in December 1925.
Begin there. It is a political cartoon in a Black periodical, an object in a political public, not a theatrical program or a modern dictionary entry.
And the title is plural. Uncle Tom's. Not one character, a category.
A category that asks viewers to see certain people in a relation to power.
This is where we have to separate what we can say from what we want to say. The cartoon itself establishes a title, a date, a publication, a medium. It establishes that the name was available in 1925 as a political image in Black public culture.
The University of Virginia's Imaging and Uncle Tom archive page gives us the contextual account. The archive explains that the cartoon belongs to A. Philip Randolph's campaign to organize Pullman-porters, and that the series represented Black leaders, editors, and porters whom it viewed as aligned with Pullman's anti-union campaign or unwilling to force confrontation.
The archive explains is doing important work in that sentence. We are not pretending its whole account is printed inside the cartoon.
The object and the archive are related, but they are not the same voice.
Still, once you have that context, the cartoon cannot be dismissed as somebody misremembering Stowe. It is using the name in an argument about employer power, labor organizing, the press, leadership, risk, and confrontation.
It is a partisan act of political naming. It draws a line between those it treats as answerable to workers and those it treats as speaking for management or declining a confrontation it considers necessary.
That unsettles my initial recovery project. I want to say, but Tom did not betray people. The cartoon places the name in a labor conflict over who stands where.
But the cartoon does not become a neutral court merely because it is politically sharp. A partisan category can make a relation visible and flatten the people inside it at the same time.
It can be a useful accusation without being a complete description.
Workers may be under different pressures. People may disagree about strategy. Someone's caution may be fear, calculation, survival, institutional limitation, or something else. The cartoon makes a political judgment. It does not eliminate the need to analyze its targets or its rhetoric.
This is what shorthand does. It speeds up moral perception. It says, look, there is an alliance with power here. But it may also speed past the conditions that made someone vulnerable, divided, compromised, or cautious. I can feel the impatience of that shortcut, because impatience is not always wicked. In political life, people often need to make a judgment before they possess a full archive. You cannot wait for perfect information every time you need to decide who has been made answerable to whom.
The alternative to a quick name cannot be endless hesitation in front of power.
But a name that acts quickly should be treated as a beginning of inquiry, not a substitute for one. The phrase may point to a relation worth investigating. It does not relieve us of investigating it.
That is one way the 1925 object sharpens the episode. The cartoon does not ask us to become neutral. It asks us to recognize that neutrality itself may be a position within a labor conflict. Yet our work as readers is not identical to the cartoonist's work as a partisan.
We have to let the cartoon accuse without treating it as a final judgment.
Its force lies in the fact that it is not merely descriptive. It is trying to organize feeling, loyalty, and opposition. It wants a public to see a set of relations and take a side.
Which brings us back to Stowe, but differently. Stowe also tries to organize feeling. She asks readers to see property relations inside domestic scenes they would rather call private. The difference is that the Messenger cartoon is not extending Stowe's argument in a straight line. It is using a portable name inside a later Black labor political struggle.
A relation, not a sequel.
The relation becomes most misleading when we turn it into a sequel. First the novel, then theater, then insult is a neat story that mistakes a set of objects for a single chain. We have a novel, a performance text, a broadside, a notice, a cartoon, an archive page, and a scholar's chronology. Our job is to keep them from impersonating one another.
And the name has force because it is mobilized within a new institutional conflict in which racialized power, representation, and solidarity are being contested. It is not simply a new word invented for the Pullman dispute.
But we must not make the opposite error and say that the Pullman dispute is somehow another version of chattel slavery.
No. The two worlds are radically unequal and institutionally distinct. Tom is under a master who can torture and kill him, who demands that he beat another enslaved person and betray fugitives.
So a comparison is not an equivalence.
A 20th century labor struggle involves employer power, representation, newspapers, union organizing, wages, risk, and confrontation. Both worlds may generate questions of complicity and solidarity. They are not the same coercive system.
So we do not solve the discomfort by saying, the cartoon is right because power is power.
Nor by saying, the cartoon is wrong because Tom was brave.
We have to stay with the fact that the same name can carry moral force across different fields, precisely because it is no longer carrying the full plot. The name is portable because it gathers a complicated relation into a quick charge. Its quickness leaves a great deal behind.
And the things left behind matter. Tom's refusal, Cassy's tactics, Jacobs' account of ownership and revolt, the exact forms of violence and dependency in each historical field.
Let me put a sharper question to you. If the cartoon is a partisan category, and if its targets cannot be judged from the cartoon alone, why should we give it so much time? Why not say it is one fascinating example and return to the book? I worry about a familiar literary habit, keeping the novel at the center and adding an archive at the edge as proof that the novel mattered.
The archive then envelops only when it confirms the novel's importance.
The cartoon does something else. It shows a Black political public using a character name for its own labor argument. It asks what the name can do in a conflict beyond the original plot.
That prevents the episode from becoming a sequence of sorrow at slavery, admiration for Stowe, and disappointment with later readers.
The cartoon asks us to notice that political language can repurpose literature, because people are trying to name a relation to power in the present. The book may be part of that vocabulary, but it is not necessarily the master of it.
Because doing that would repeat the hierarchy the episode is trying to interrogate. It would make Stowe's novel the serious text, and Black labor journalism a footnote about what happened after the real story.
And because the cartoon changes what the phrase means in public.
It shows the name being actively used within Black political argument. It is not the passive remainder of an image made elsewhere. It has been taken up to mark a conflict over representation and solidarity.
The plural matters to me. Uncle Tom's. The cartoon is not asking us to identify one mistaken reader of Stowe. It is making a category, and categories are ways of organizing a public. They tell viewers where to direct distrust, impatience, loyalty, and anger.
A category is efficient. It condenses a political judgment before the whole argument has been spoken.
Which can be clarifying. If a worker sees people presented as representatives, but acting in a way that appears to protect employer power, a quick name may make a hidden alignment visible. The phrase can say, "Do not be distracted by respectable language, titles, or proximity to the powerful. Look at the relation."
And it can also make the individual inside that relation disappear. We know the archive's contextual account. We know the cartoon's title and its visual political existence. We do not have a complete case file on every person whom the series treated as suspect.
That is where our viewerly desire for moral certainty has to slow down. A cartoon is built to make you see quickly. An archive makes it possible to ask, what conflict produced that demand for quick seeing? Neither task is identical to writing a neutral biography of its targets.
Nor should a request for more context become a way of emptying the accusation of force. "We need more information" can be an honest intellectual statement. It can also be the oldest way of waiting until a conflict has become safe enough to admire.
That is why the counter case is hard. I do not want nuance to become a way of deferring judgment about employer power, compromised leadership, and institutional caution.
But neither can we use the word complicity as though it answered every question about risk. People occupy different institutional positions. They may be exposed differently to punishment, exclusion, loss of work, or the demands of those who depend on them.
The phrase Uncle Tom is powerful, partly because it refuses those explanations when they look too much like accommodation. It says, there are moments when explanation is becoming an alibi.
And the historian's task is not to abolish that political force. It is to ask what the force is attached to, who is speaking, what evidence the object controls, and what remains uncertain.
The 1925 cartoon shifts the question from Stowe's reputation to how political communities judge representation. Who can speak for whom? Who gets to decide that another person has crossed from strategy into service? What does solidarity demand when power is organized through an employer rather than through a master?
Those questions are not answered by the novel. They are made harder by it, which is a different kind of usefulness.
And they are made harder by Cassy and Jacobs, too. Their texts teach us to ask how danger distributes itself. The category in the cartoon may be politically necessary, but a category never carries every kind of danger with equal fidelity.
That is why we must hold the object at the center without allowing it to become a universal explanation.
This does not establish agreement beyond the object itself.
We have no right to make a single cartoon stand for a collective Black consensus. It documents one use of the name in Black public culture that cannot be reduced to a white theatrical stereotype.
But then, why let one object reorganize so much of the episode? Why not call it an interesting footnote and return to the more familiar materials?
Because the question is not how much evidence we possess in the abstract. The question is what this evidence changes. The cartoon shows that the name can operate as a plural political category in a Black labor public. That prevents us from treating later use as only a white theatrical remainder or a reader's mistake about the novel.
Its scale is limited, but its function is not trivial. It changes the kind of history we have to write.
It gives us neither an origin nor a consensus. It gives us a documented use, then requires us to ask what institutional conflict made that use intelligible. The archive supplies a bounded context for that question. It does not provide the target's full biographies, their private motives, or a complete map of Black opinion.
So a small archive can make a large claim impossible, and a different claim necessary.
It can require better proportions. We give the object enough attention to alter our argument, but not so much authority that it speaks for every worker, editor, or political strategy in the field.
There is a further complication. Adena Spingarn argues that the derogatory political sense of Uncle Tom emerged in Black political rhetoric in the 1910s.
We should be exact here. Spingarn argues that. Our directly verified primary object is the 1925 cartoon. We are not claiming to have independently found the first 1910s use.
I am relieved by that limitation.
Why?
Because it forces the conversation to state what kind of knowledge it has. The cartoon as object, the archive as context, and a scholar's argument about a broader chronology.
And they should remain different in the script. The history becomes unreliable when every source is made to speak with the same authority.
The cartoon is not the origin story. It is the counter case that stops us from making one too quickly. There is something else the cartoon has forced me to revise. I thought the ethical task was to defend Tom against a slur. Now I think the harder task is to ask what happens when defense itself becomes a way of avoiding a political accusation.
That is the right revision. Textual recovery can clarify what a later shorthand leaves behind. It cannot automatically dissolve the conflict in which the shorthand became useful.
And labor politics recovery can clarify why the name mattered in 1925. It cannot turn a partisan image into a final judgment on the people it names. We should not rescue the book by dismissing Black political language.
Nor should we treat that language as requiring us to disregard Tom, Cassy, and Eliza.
Then we need to return to the book on the chair. The paperback is still on the chair.
It has not moved.
I know. Leaving it there has become a way of postponing putting it back.
You could put it back now.
I cannot put it back without thinking differently about it. It is also true. When I picked it up, I thought the problem was simple. There is an insult that misdescribes a character. Correct the description. Return the book to its proper place.
And now?
Now I think the correction is necessary, but insufficient. Tom's refusals matter. If we forget that he refuses to beat Lucy and refuses to betray Cassy and Emmeline, we lose the very actions that make his moral world legible. But if we stop there, we turn Stowe into the final judge of every later use of the name.
Which she cannot be.
Because the name leaves the novel. It enters print, performance, advertising, images, arguments, and conflicts. It becomes portable.
And each medium selects. A stage selects bodies, scenery, music, exits, tableau, a public ending. A political cartoon selects a type, a conflict, an accusation. Selection does not simply lie. It makes some relation visible by leaving other relations outside the frame.
The 1925 Messenger cartoon makes a relation to employer power visible. It says that the question of representation and solidarity is urgent enough to name people sharply. That sharpness is politically serious. It is not a trivial error that disappears because we have reread a novel.
But sharpness is not total knowledge. The cartoon does not make its targets transparent to us. It does not tell us every pressure they faced, every reason they acted as they did, or every disagreement inside Black labor politics.
In different worlds, the novel and the cartoon both ask what happens when power wants you to become useful to it.
But they ask it under different institutions, different dangers, and different relations of force. We should not borrow moral seriousness from one field by pretending it is the same as another.
A portable name lets us carry a moral relation across time. It can help us notice an alliance with power, but it can also make the histories inside that relation too easy to carry.
A name carries less context than a story.
I am going to put the book back now,
Carefully.
in a place where it cannot fall on anyone.
Then the remaining question is, when does political shorthand help us recognize a real relation to power? And when does it obscure the histories, pressures, and rival solidarities that the shorthand invokes?
We do not have to settle that tonight.
No. But we do have to stop pretending the shortcut has settled it for us. There. This is Critical Animal. If I got under your skin, good. Subscribe and bring me to your next dinner party. See you next time.